here with we are live here with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon. I'm joined today by Dr. Ken Pendleton. Ken, how are you?
I am doing okay.
Pretty exciting game last night in the national championship. I know you had a little bit of rooting interest, although we try to stay neutral as much as possible.
Right. I will only say from a neutral perspective that it was a great game for me.
Fantastic. So, on the subject of college sports, there's been a lot of continued press about the potential or options around pay for play for student athletes. And there was actually an article in the Huffington Post that one of our interns and some of our colleagues that we work closely with commented on quite a bit. And my hope is that we could take this on as a topic today and try and dig a little deeper about what some of the options and issues are that are underlying all of this.
Okay.
So, in particular, can you give us some history, specifically around amateurism in intercollegiate athletics, and then some of the driving forces behind what's going on for the whole idea of pay for play for student athletes?
Okay. So I'll try to do this as succinctly as possible. It's sort of a 140-year history. Up until 1948, you were in theory not supposed to compensate athletes with any kind of scholarships. The idea in its original form was you were only supposed to recruit from athletes from already enrolled students. In 1948, the NCAA adopted what was called the Sanity Code. That is to say, they thought it was insane to think that teams weren't going to actually try to induce athletes to enroll in school, even if they weren't necessarily financially able or academically qualified. And so they allowed for need-based scholarships all of a sudden. Now the problem with this was, of course, is if you were of financial means, that meant you weren't allowed to get a scholarship, and so there was a good deal of problems with accounting and bookkeeping. So in 1956, not only did the NCAA adopt the idea that you could give scholarships entirely based upon athletic merit, but they also did a couple of other things that were very important. One is that they actually did give athletes a kind of stipend, and they also guaranteed their scholarships for 4 years. So in theory, you could have come in that first day, not like the way the coach was treating you, and said, "I'm just going to be a student," and they couldn't really do anything about it. Both of those latter changes were eliminated by 1973. That is to say, they maintained the idea of scholarships being given entirely on the basis of athletic merit, but they got rid of the stipend, and they got rid of and scholarships only became guaranteed for 1 year. They were no longer automatically rolled over, which gave a great deal of leverage to coaches. So in the last 40 years, the revenue generating sports have generated more revenue than could have ever been imagined back in the day. And so the issue of giving athletes a stipend has arisen again, and it's been basically put forward as a fairness issue and also an issue of being realistic. We're back to sort of the sanity problem. Basically, given the amount of money that's out there and the amount of money that athletes could make in playing professional, is it realistic to think that we're going to keep the agents and alum and everyone at bay when the athletes in many instances themselves don't really, basically feel like they're being done an injustice, that they're helping generate all of this money and being the ones at greatest risk of, for example, injury, and yet they're not allowed to be compensated beyond their scholarship, which is often not enough to actually meet their expenses as students.
And so, Ken, can you talk a bit about what some of the underlying fundamentals for this spirit of amateurism are, and why that is even an important part of this discussion?
Well, I mean, the NCAA was born of the idea that amateur athletics were fundamentally different than professional athletics, and that's why when they introduced the Sanity Code in 1948, that was really the fundamental moment when a lot of people said, "Wait a second, this isn't amateurism anymore because you're giving someone a free education." But what they argued is that free education is not like being given $50,000. Right, that you might go spend in any number of ways on an automobile or trips or girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever. They argued that education, essentially giving someone an education, was in keeping with the amateur mission, right? And so that's how they've been able to maintain that argument. And they, of course, rightly point out that an education has a lifetime worth of value, and in many instances, these athletes come from backgrounds where they would not be able to get a college education, and now they're getting one, and this may change the trajectory of their family for generations to come.
Right. And for those in our viewing audience who aren't as familiar with the issues, can you talk about why, especially in the money sports, student athletes don't go directly to their profession if they're ready to earn money at it, or able to be a contributor from a professional standpoint?
Right. Well, there's and the three major sports have different rules. In baseball, you indeed can go straight from high school to sign a professional contract and bypass college, and indeed a very high percentage of athletes do that. In basketball, you now have to stay in college for 1 year before you're eligible for the draft. And so someone like Andrew Wiggins, who may or may not be ready for the NBA yet, it made it very clear that he would not have gone to Kansas. He would have gone straight to the NBA had that option been available, but he has to attend a university for 1 year. And then in college football, you're not eligible to play professionally until 3 years after your high school graduation class. So in this past year's draft, the defensive end from South Carolina, Jadeveon Clowney, would probably have been the first pick, or certainly been among the first picks in the draft after his sophomore season, but he had to play an additional season because he's simply ineligible for the NFL draft.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And so it's a very different market that we're talking about than your standard job market, where if you're a musician and you're deciding whether or not to go to Berklee College of Music to further your skills, you could even earn on the side while you're doing that, right? If you have a label out there or an album, it's not regulated in the way that athletics are.
Right. I would assume, so if our viewers know it, have know otherwise, please let us know. But I assume if I was Yo-Yo Ma, and the next Yo-Yo Ma, that if Juilliard and Harvard and Yale and whatever other great Berkeley musical school, if they all wanted to bid for me and offer me $150,000 a year to go there, there is not a national, an NCAA for music that says no, you can't do that. Now, and so yeah, basically the role the NCAA is served is to basically to stipulate the rules under which athletes can be compensated across the board by universities at the different levels, whether they be 1A, 1AA, or what have you, or all the way down to Division III.
Right, and so this kind of leads us into transition to some of the arguments for and against pay. So when we start talking about against pay, protecting the current system, can we start there a little bit, and between the two of us try and layer in some of the arguments? And again, our job here isn't to solve the problem, but to start framing what some of the issues are that are out there and some possible ways you might approach such a problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's really good arguments for not paying, paying a stipend to athletes to actually meet what they're now calling full cost of attendance. Intuitively, it seems it seems right that you would get the full cost of attendance. The problem with that is that money has to come from somewhere, and so that money could very well cost, for example, non-generating sports. So it may not be a problem at a place like the University of Texas or the Ohio State or the University of Florida, where they basically generate enough revenue to support large numbers of non-revenue generating sports. But in cases where athletic departments are barely breaking even or even losing money, if they have to pay full cost of attendance to say 130 athletes, that could very well mean the death of a couple of really sports like rowing or wrestling. And so that's that's a really huge downside, for actually paying the athletes full cost of attendance. On the other hand, as I said, there's sort of a moral argument to be made here in favor of the athletes, which is that they are generating all this money for the university in the case of the non-revenue generating sports, and the idea that they're not paid full cost of attendance, that an athlete may end up having $4,000 too few dollars to just live a normal university life seems intuitively unjust. Second, as I mentioned before, it probably causes a lot more scandals. Players are probably going to look for ways to get whatever money they need to attend. A lot of players won't do that, and they're just going to toe the line, and they're going to do what the rule says. But there are other players who are going to be tempted to take money from an agent or try to sell their apparel or sell their tickets to someone who's not a family member or a student. So it presents a huge policing problem. And so that's what the NCAA in its member institutions have to try to balance off are the two sides of that issue.
Right. And can we stay with some of the challenges on both sides of it? When you were talking about sports that are non-revenue generating, Temple University comes to mind, who recently, in their push to have a successful football program, has actually cut a number of non-revenue generating sports to try and be a bit more focused. And there's been a bit of an outcry around that. Sports that had a lot of history with that university are no longer slated to continue. On the other side, if you look at equivalents, other students who are part of the university community, I think there are probably lots of PhD students and others who, well, aren't compensated greatly beyond and contribute a whole lot to the bottom line of a university and the type of revenue they're part of big science grants that come in and a lot of other ways that money comes into a university to help fund the overall mission. Universities in general tend to operate a bit on a socialist model, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, it would be very interesting to know what percentage of students at various schools don't have enough resources for full cost of attendance as it's being calculated. Like, we tend to assume that it's athletes who are unique in this regard, and that may be the case. It may be that the average student who gets accepted to University of Oregon or to Appalachian State or Temple actually has the resources for full cost of attendance, but if I imagine in the case of students who come from financially disadvantaged backgrounds, that's probably not true. And so it would be interesting as an empirical matter to actually try to to sort of look at what the solutions are for this on the academic side, and then look at how they would compare to the athletic side.
Yeah. So some of the arguments that you're hearing out there, you touched on a few of them. Can you dig a little deeper into either for or against changing what's currently the status quo?
Well, at this point, I think the momentum is increasingly for some kind of additional compensation to try to reach that goal of full cost of attendance. And I think I think this is partly being driven by externals, such as the lawsuit that Ed O'Bannon and others have filed for their image rights with the NCAA and EA Sports, that they're making this very legal political case that they essentially were being exploited. And so I think the NCAA feels a great deal of need to try to feel some pressure to try to actually be able to argue that no, the compensation is fair. How legally relevant that'll be, I don't know. But I think from a PR point of view, it has real value for them to actually be able to say, we now pay full cost of attendance to all athletes.
Yeah, and so at its best, right, the student-athlete experience, when functioning properly, you are getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the academic side and all that growth and development that happens from being part of a university and classes and socialization that happens, along with the incredible experiences that can be afforded to you on the athlete side of that equation, right? Between the coaching and support and training and development and travel and experiences you get. But the argument obviously here is that that's not always a fair equation for everyone, right?
Yeah, no, I mean unfortunately, as long as you work within this sort of financial zero-sum game where if you compensate the athletes more, that there could be a real cost at a lot of schools to the non-revenue generating sports. Then you're always going to have to decide how you want to strike that balance. The other way you could try to generate more money, for example, by charging student fees, which they already pay in many instances to help their athletic departments. But again, how happy, it'd be interesting to see how happy students would be with the idea of that. And I say that in an open-ended way, because I on one hand I know students would be very sensitive to higher fees. On the other hand, I think many students are sympathetic to the idea that athletes are such an important part of university life, and they're probably sympathetic to the idea that they often are the ones who struggle financially to be able to make ends meet, especially if they come from financially disadvantaged backgrounds. I want to mention one other idea that's worth considering in this, and it was actually proposed by Frank DeFord, the venerable NPR commentator and Sports Illustrated writer, and he suggested that you actually allow agents to pay out, to essentially contract with athletes while they're at the college level. And this would mean that the university wouldn't be responsible for the full cost of attendance money, but rather the money would come from a third source. So now they wouldn't disadvantage the non-revenue generating sports. The downside of this, of course, would mean that the coaches would have to actually interact with someone who has a really important back table role. An agent, for example, could exert could be a real pain, I can imagine, for a lot of coaches. On the other hand, the coaches would know who they were dealing with then. Whereas now, if we take Josh Luck's allegations seriously, and most agents seem to confirm that that there are a lot of agents who are doing what Josh Luck was doing. Their agents are already on the back table. They're already working in the background, and it'd be worth taking seriously. Or the idea of giving them a place at the table and acknowledging their seat at the table might actually might be really helpful for eliminating things like occurred with Reggie Bush. And so it has the advantage, of course, of not costing the athletic departments more money.
Right. So, in the spirit of this, there's been a lot of creative solutions thrown out. We both read and watched and heard and talked with folks about this issue, and the question becomes a bit about what is the problem, right? I haven't heard a clear and concise and agreed upon problem statement. And then who are the stakeholders? Who are the folks that should be at the table, have a say in any solution or change that would be proposed?
Yeah.
If you were to state the problem, how would you state it, just out of curiosity?
I think I've tried to state it before in this interview, which is I think the problem was perceived on two fronts. One is one of fairness, that the athletes feel like they are the ones who are actually generating the revenue and taking the greatest risk to do so, and yet they're the ones who are not allowed to exercise market forces or take advantage of market forces to actually receive the revenue commensurate with what they actually feel they're producing. And that goes with the second part, which is therefore they're often, in many instances, they're seeking revenue in ways that are actually illegal. And so you've got a pervasive problem that we've seen at many universities in the last, especially in the last 10 years, it seems. Mm-hmm. And so when you transition to the second part of what you were asking, which is about the stakeholders, I think it's very interesting because when you actually read the Huffington Post piece, the people who are getting to make this discussion are the NCAA and the athletic directors. There still isn't much mention of actually finding a way to get athletes or agents who are clearly vested in this any kind of place at the table to negotiate negotiate here. And I it would be very interesting to think about whether it would actually be wise in terms of trying to reach some meaningful understanding on this issue to include all the relevant parties in that discussion from the beginning.
Yeah, I started to think of all the stakeholders you could imagine, and my list would be quite broad, right? If you were trying to engage folks properly, it'd be university presidents, board of trustees, it'd be some of the leagues to which folks are hoping to graduate out and become professional in these sports. It would be certainly folks who advocate around gender equality, because right now the way the revenue structure is set up, it doesn't, the market would not support gender equality in the way that the revenue is flowing through there, so you have to have other fixes around there. Certainly agents, as you mentioned, former student athletes, current student athletes, and future student athletes, they're all folks that are going to be impacted greatly by any changes that get made.
Yeah, I think you do a really good job of adding to the relatively small list that I had made, and I think that and this is very hard to do when you're used to having so much power and say, but sometimes it's actually really wise to try to democratize the process and bring all those relevant parties into the discussion, because then you're going to have a result that's going to be is much more likely to be satisfactory to all of them, and then something that actually can hopefully address or lower the amount of scandals that occur, because I think the NCAA, I think they're aware that they've been beset by an unprecedented amount of problems in the last 10 years, and they've clearly taken steps they had never taken before to address those. And I would point out, for example, hiring Miles Brand as president of the NCAA, which was the first time they sort of went outside the athletic community and hired a university president, spoke to the idea that they feel like they needed to do something, very different. And they've really made progress in certain levels, such as academic, the academic graduation rates have gotten much better. And so the using the APR, the Academic Progress Report, has been a really good constructive step. And so I think they really, when you look at it from a process point of view, they need, before you dive into the issues, you really need to think about how can we structure this process in such a way that we can get all the most, all the parties to give it, to be represented and to give the most constructive input for goals that they're generally shared among everybody, such as athletic excellence, academic progress, fiscal fairness, and responsibility.
Right, so there's been some reform in terms of what are the report cards that you measure success for in athletic departments, and those have helped an awful lot. And I imagine that if we were to frame the problem with coming from the appropriate list of stakeholders, those report cards might even expand a bit in terms of other things that you would want to measure to see what is success and what isn't. Certainly, when you look at the stakeholders from a university side, the number of different needs for different types of universities is going to be pretty phenomenal, right? So your top big huge programs out there, and you named a bunch of them, they have a very different relationship with their big time sports than some of the second tier and third tier. And this is all still in potentially folks who are in the BCS running and all of that, but there's still a tremendous variety in terms of resources they have available and their ability to support some of the reform ideas that are out there.
Yeah, no, and this is a really important point. Given the revenue disparity between, say, the really big schools, like cite the University of Texas, the University of Florida, and then you go down and then at the other end of the Division I schools, where you're talking about schools like Louisiana Tech or Arkansas State, the income and then you bring in the Division II, the 1AAs, 2s, the 3s, and it's going to be increasingly difficult to find common grounds beyond certain core values. Everybody's going to say, we believe in academic integrity, we believe in promote athletic excellence as a way of teaching non-cognitive skills that are going to have lifelong value. We believe in the value of competitive sports. But when you get beyond those core values, how they get implemented at those different levels because of the income disparities is so different that has to almost be the starting point for the conversation. What kind of common ground can you find there to build some kind of consensus, from between the schools like say Ohio University on the one hand and the University of Oregon on the other.
Absolutely, and really trying to figure out what are those clear delineations that you want between those universities, and does that impact even the way that we set up their schedules and everything else for playing, because these have tremendous snowballing effects when you make these kinds of reforms. And certainly one of the things that I get concerned with in the conversation right now is that I don't think there is even consensus on what the problem is. I certainly don't think there's consensus on who the stakeholders should be. And because of that, there hasn't been anything that, to me, resembles appropriate assessment. So a real and deep dive analysis. The article we're referencing in the Huffington Post, there's a couple interesting facts. There's a couple, small research items. Those are helpful. But if you're really trying to understand what the problem is, I don't think anyone could really give you a comprehensive set of data that's going to go through the different needs of the different organizations we've been talking about and the different stakeholders. There's lots of stories that are compelling when you hear them. Folks who are struggling, student athletes, are really not having the experience they would hope for, and then there's folks who, on the other hand, got everything they ever wanted out of that experience of being a student athlete and felt like the value was probably 10 times what they even expected.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always think of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and he makes a distinction between good intentions and goodwill. Good intentions are not wanting your guest who's had a few too many to get in an accident on the way home. Goodwill is calling that person a cab or letting them stay in your spare bedroom or on the couch. In other words, it's using all the resources at your disposal to solve the problem. And I think the NCAA has good intentions. They really want to find some way to treat the athletes fairly while not undermining the non-revenue generating sports, working across the board with the universities of different sizes. But I don't think that they've summoned all the resources that they possibly, at their disposal to try to align all those interests to the extent that they can.
And certainly change of this nature is very painful. If you're going to make any kind of change in this space, think of how many decisions get made based on the current system when it comes to what type of facilities you're building now, what type of contracts you're signing with coaches, what type of recruiting allocations and sports you're going to keep on and emphasize or de-emphasize. All of that is based on a current set of systems and structures, and any change that gets made is going to be painful and quite slow, I would imagine.
Yes, yeah, no, I think that's true. But I think in the long run, if you're willing to go through that complicated process, you might actually not have nearly as many scandals as have occurred in the last decade. And to me, a painful process is a small, if lengthy and costly price to pay compared to undermining the very integrity of your mission, which is what's really been happening, what these scandals have done the last 10 years.
Yeah, for me, from a process standpoint, this is your classic measure, measure again before you start cutting, because if you start making changes without properly defining the problem, properly identifying who your stakeholders are, and figuring out what some of the data is that will help you make creative solutions, then you're probably going to take one set of problems, maybe solve some of them, and replace them with a whole new set of problems. So while reform could be very meaningful, it's going to have to be very deliberate and very thoughtful. And certainly the type of things that have been bantered about right now haven't sound as comprehensive as that type of approach.
Yeah, yes, that's certainly been the perception, and my perception, reading through this material over the years, that the problems have been, largely been solved in a kind of ad hoc way rather than trying to approach these issues systematically.
Yeah, so stay tuned on it. But I think for us, you and I, what we're always trying to advocate for is more effective process of the decision making. And I would say, this playing out in lawsuits and those type of forums, they may have the impact and change, but they won't necessarily bring you to the best solution.
Right. No, I mean, lawsuits, as we know, are a last resort, and the implications of them, could be pretty dire. So if it's possible to, and I think we're specifically thinking of the O'Bannon case here, if it's possible to reach some kind of meaningful conciliation before then, I would, at the risk of being an advocate, I would strongly urge them to do it, because if you wait for the legal outcome, you don't know where those chips are going to fall by the time it's all done.
Absolutely. So it's going to be an interesting issue to see play out. I don't think we're going to see anything monumental this year. Certainly, the NCAA signaled that no change is imminent by any means, and but those things can get forced and those timelines can get changed depending on the outcome of lawsuits like O'Bannon or lawsuits that we don't even know that are in the pipeline set to come. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I thought that was a really good final thought, so I'll leave that with you.
All right. Well, thank you again. Much appreciated.